Hey, gang. In this second of the series on gender psychology and culture, we're going to go into the second half of that list of the different biological predispositions that we started in the first video. And then we're going to go from there to a deeper dive into what we think it might mean as we continue to build our model for a value system that is positive and nurturing. All right, here we are, part two.
Back again.
I don't know how long it's going to be, but we're here at part two of gender, psychology, and culture analysis. There's a whole lot of stuff to dig into here, and we want to do it justice. We want to do a nuanced approach, avoiding all kinds of screaming and carrying on that we see online all the time. So my plan is then to work through the rest of the differences that have been observed by the studies that we started looking at last time. And then from there, once we have a good rough idea of what those are, as best as we can tell now, the bigger question, right? What do we do with this? But we got to start with this because we can't just ask, what do we do with these differences? We don't know what they really are. Right. Okay. So we talked about anger last time and the various ways in which it gets manifested, its connection with violence, and what we observe as statistical differences between males and females. The next one on our list to look at is impulsivity. Now, I think anyone with any experience at all could make a wild guess as to what they think the differences are here. But let me just throw out here first, like overall risk-taking behavior. Where would you guess that would be at between 0 and 4?
For men and women?
So like the number, remember, represents how big of a difference there is, if there is one at all. If it's 0, then there's no major difference. Kind of like the experience of feeling angry, there was no difference between men and women. The experience of using a weapon to harm someone else measured at a 3. And again, just to reiterate for our 3 fans, the numbers represent differences that are not just observed differences, right? It's not enough to say that there's a biological difference. So these studies are aimed at trying to suss out exactly which differences are due to biology and evolution rather than cultural. Now, later, quite a bit later, I have planned a much deeper dive into how can culture affect these, and they can affect them tremendously. But we need to be able to figure out exactly if a particular behavior is observed in a culture, is it primarily because men or women have a natural tendency to be that way, or is it because they have a natural tendency, but the culture has shifted it in one direction or the other, whether to amplify it or to suppress it? These are important questions. So this is our ground zero here. What are the differences at all? So with that said, what are your thoughts on this one?
I think for men, it could be a 3 or 4, and then women a 1.
Okay, so let me clarify the number. Okay, so the number represents the difference between the genders. So it's not that there's one separate number for each.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Got it.
So like if there's a 3, that means that we see a difference at all. And it's a fairly significant difference. In fact, in this case, it's 2. It's measured at 2. So there is a moderate difference that is most likely due to biological influence. It means that we have it in there are, and it's in the direction of males, right? So males are moderately more likely and tend towards more risky behavior than women do. Okay. Of course, there's individuals that are going to be exceptions to this, always. But that's what we see. Interesting. All right. So now what about effortful control? So in other words, here's one that says, if I have an impulse to do something, how easy is it for me to curtail that, to keep myself from acting on that? Is there a difference between men and women here? That's a tough one. It's a
That is
really
a good
tough one. No,
One.
no,
Mm.
it's actually a 4 in favor of women.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, so apparently the presence of testosterone makes it a little bit tougher to, rein in the impulses. Okay, now we can get into a little bit about like what does this mean. I don't want to dive too deeply into this yet, but an observation that comes to mind immediately here is if a difference in control, being able like self-control or self-discipline, for example, is you see this in between the genders. It is not saying that it is okay for people to act like fools just because they can't control themselves, right? It would be easy to make a jump like that, but that's baloney, right? That's crap. All this is saying is that nature has crafted around the small gamete makers um, less inherent controls on those impulses, and it's only because that leads to reproductive success in males more than it would in females. Okay, so when you think of it that way, it makes a lot of sense. Uh, because in the ancestral environment, in the animal world, which is where we're diving down to this level, if there's a lot of intense competition for mates among males more than there is among females, then it's the one that takes the most risks is going to win and get reproductive success if that risk taking is rewarded. Right. So what you would need is to show, and these studies here have dived into this, that in the primate lineage, that risk taking behavior rewards males more than it does females. Okay. All right. So then that gives us a whole lot more impulsive males than females. Comedians make all kinds of money off of this kind of stuff, right? Because they'll say, the difference between men and women, well, men are stupider, because they do crazy stuff, that kind of thing. But there is a biological, imperative in there. Okay.
Yeah, and when I think of impulse, it's like impulse control according to who, right? So, like, and so when you asked it, it was, yeah, I mean, it makes more sense for men to be more kind of testy, extroverted wise in terms of risk taking in the environment, because it probably does equate to more mating opportunities and so on and so forth. But then when I think of impulse control, it's just like, well, do you have the discipline enough according to this set structure and these rules in order for you to negate said impulses?
Right.
So I guess that's where my mind goes.
Yeah, and a lot of this boils down to one of the major differences and that we talked about last time, which is the potential for massive reproductive success is higher in males in all species than it is in females, almost all species. But that gets modified based on lifestyle. And I don't mean like today's lifestyle. I mean like lifestyle in terms of biology, like how one survived the whole life cycle. Now, so some examples of what we're talking about here, okay, because this would be easy to misinterpret. For example, young men are 4 times more likely to suffer death from external causes than young women are. Okay, so this is one of the pieces of evidence that suggests this. That risk gets even higher if you pair them with other young men. And the risk goes down if you're pairing women with young infants when you're looking at risks of death caused by external causes. If you have one study they talked about where they were looking at male skateboarders, and they noticed that if you inject a young female onlooker into a crowd of male skateboarders, the level of risk-taking moves that they engage in increases, which increases their number of outlandish successes, but also crashes. Okay. So in terms of risky behavior in evolution, there's a risk versus benefit calculation that goes into this in deep time. And you'll have a variety of individuals that have a higher or low level of risk-taking behavior. And if the riskiness is rewarded with reproductive success, that'll skew the population over time. So because of the fundamental difference between the gametes and the way that they are propagated, women don't get as much success from wild, outlandish risk-taking in the long run. Mm-hmm. And that led to a biological predisposition to be risk averse in the case of females and risk seeking in case of males in general, mm-hmm. Right? So this is one of those bimodal curve situations. Mm-hmm. One of the people that watched the last video pointed out that I make a lot of contextualizing comments to make sure that I'm, reinforcing against potential, offending people. And that is true. I don't want this to be about offense to anyone. Right. I want us to understand what's going on here. Yeah. So that we can make better decisions and more, human decisions. All right. Enough of that. Let's go to fear and pain. So the experience of fear, meaning as opposed to anxiety, which is a more long-term subjective sensation, fear is a short-term subjective sensation, immediately recognizing danger. Would you imagine that there is a difference between the genders there?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. It is. And it's a 4. Okay. It's a big one. There's a large difference there. They didn't get into this in this particular article, but in the terms of anxiety, it's a 2, again, in favor of females, but only during childbirthing years. So there seems to be a pretty direct, measurable influence of the hormones on that mental state. Well, hormonal state affects the brain affects, our lived experience. It's not everything can be reduced to the brain, right? We've been down that road. But nevertheless, it's still there and it's still important. Okay, so again, the experience of fear showing a sex difference, not a shocker, for the same reason as the risk-taking stuff. Same thing. Pain tolerance. This is another one. This one's a 4 also, and meaning that men have a higher pain tolerance. There's a couple of exceptions to this. One, of course, childbirth can't be measured. And I think there's probably good evidence. I'd have to research this further, but the experience of childbirth may involve the release of endogenous endorphins that actually increase pain tolerance significantly during that time frame. But the rest of the time, it's higher. But that means, though, that again, you tie this into the business of risk-taking and potentially crashing your skateboard or whatever it is that you're getting involved with. A higher pain tolerance is going to contribute to that success of that strategy. What's the trade-off, though?
With a higher pain tolerance?
Yeah.
A higher risk of getting injured and
higher risk
continuing.
Of permanent damage.
Yeah, permanent damage. Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
So we're going back to that 4 times more likely to suffer death. Mm-hmm. But the potential reproductive success of the male makes that an acceptable risk. Now, if looking at this from the point of an individual male, right, I am an N of 1 in my universe. Okay, I may have that, but at the same time, in my conscious thinking, it's like, well, that's not an acceptable risk for me. I'm not interested in dying. Okay, so this is a mistake that sometimes people make when they're discussing this stuff, is they're talking about statistical realities here, and then they immediately boil it down to, well, what does that mean for me? We got to do the work to get to that first. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's what we're doing here. So now there is another exception to this, and that's man flu. Okay, I'm sure you've heard of that. The thing is, though, there is actually something to the phenomenon of man flu, right? And a lot of times it gets talked about with a sort of derogatory undertone of men are just exaggerating their symptoms and boo-hooing when they have a flu. But the flu and other sort of viruses that are in that same class, actually, there is higher morbidity, mortality in men than women. So there seems to be a testosterone-related vulnerability, and testosterone does affect the immune system. It's a suppressant, actually. So there is something to that, right? So there is more suffering, apparently. So we talked about anxiety, neuroticism, which has a kind of textbook definition that you see in personality testing literature. Not
Big
much
five.
difference. Not much difference. I wouldn't have. I guess stereotypically you wouldn't guess that. You would maybe label women as more neurotic, or even men, right? You might say men are more neurotic, but neither one of those is true. Negative emotions, shame, and guilt. No difference, or very small difference measured. So, statistically, maybe not all that important. So, as important as the differences are, it's also important for us to point out the things that aren't different, even though our culture may say otherwise. Now, I grew up in the 70s where there was all kinds of gender stereotypes flying around. Now, I mean, they're still around, but they didn't even try to hide it back then. It was just, on the sitcoms and everything, and it was kind of cringy. But a lot of that stuff doesn't hold. A lot of those things didn't hold. That's so I was kind of annoyed when I was, like, man, that was crap, and it was generally pretty sexist against women at that time.
Yeah.
So there we are. Spatial abilities. Okay. This one that you may already know about because there's been a lot of talk about this for years, but mental rotation men have an advantage in. And I think it's tied to it being more advantageous for males of any given species that reproduces in the way that mammals do, for example, to have a wider territorial range. It's more advantageous for them than it is for women or females of a species. And so that led to a skewing of tendencies and skill development in the mental rotation, particular skill. Overall interest in things as opposed to people skews towards the males again, or you could say it the other way. So interest in people skews towards females.
It's females.
Yeah, right. No shock. I don't think any big shock there. Now, as far as like the explanation for that, the evolutionary explanation for that, that one's a little tougher. They do talk about it in the article here, and it's kind of technical, but I think overall it seems as though it has to do maybe with warfare and hunting, which are typically male activities. Not, of course, women can participate in those things, and they have throughout history, but not to the degree. And having a few exceptions to the rule is not going to necessarily affect these large statistical swaths that we're looking at. Okay. Overall, systematizing object-based reasoning, engineering interests. Again, since it's object-focused and centered, it's already giving us an advantage towards the testosterone suffused brains. Okay, so that kind of intelligence, there is a slight advantage. It's a 4, so it is a significant difference there. By contrast, emotional intelligence skews the other way. Okay, so again, let's look into the future for a second and say, what might this mean for culture? I would think as an educator, for example, just to pick education out of the air, because a lot of this gets applied to education, then I would want to make sure that we don't say, what we don't want to do first off, is say, well, girls are no good at this, so we're not going to bother teaching it to them, right? That was the way they did it back in the old days, right? A really terrible idea. I don't know why they came up with that. But by the same token, right, people skills, attachment, interest in people, and all that kind of thing. Are we going to say, boys aren't as good at that as women, so let's not bother teaching them that? No, that's a stupid idea too, right? So both of those, it's more, let's tailor the educational approach to help build up those things they may not have as great a strength as the other sex does. That's my thought. I'm sure educators out there might love to weigh in, amongst our three, patrons. So here's some other ones. Here's a whole laundry. I'm gonna give you a laundry list of stuff that is not different, okay? Which may surprise you, right? Personal space, anxious avoidant attachment styles, touch initiation, intimacy in relationships, agreeableness. No gender difference between these two. Is that shocking or not really?
Not really. I mean, I think for me, where my head goes is the presentation of disagreeableness might be different.
Right. Yeah. That's a downstream effect.
Yeah, exactly.
That's true. Okay. What about overall empathic capacity, empathy? Does either sex have the edge here?
I don't think so.
Women do. Women have the edge here. It's a 3. This one is. And the explanations for this vary some, but I think it probably is tied to the capacity for violence. We already saw that was a difference, and these things aren't independent of each other, right? They connect, right? So it's easier to be more violent if you have a harder time accessing empathic experience, is one way to put it. Right? So it means that in general, again, on larger scales, statistically speaking, boys may need more work here than girls to help get them up to speed. Emotional intelligence, that's another thing that women have the edge on, but it's a 2. Interest in people over things is a 3, of course, just like the interest in objects over people was a 3 for males. Peer attachment. Any ideas? This is a tough one because, like, in what context, right? Yeah, in what context? So this one I'm not sure about, but it does measure as a 2 in favor of females, interestingly enough. Same-sex disclosure is, again, favors females, which kind of tracks with my own personal experience anecdotally, but I never would have guessed that it necessarily generalized, but it does seem to, cross-culturally and all that. Remember, all these are, the higher the number is, the more likely we're talking about something that's cross-culturally observed. All right. Language ability, reading, writing, and spelling, all of those things, if you lump them together, would you give the edge to one or the other, or no? Okay. Females actually have the edge here. All these different capacities, interestingly enough, right? So on one end, you've got objects and mechanical reasoning, mental rotation. Males have a slight edge there, and these capacities, females have a slight edge. Interestingly enough, yeah. So now I've read some books on this that are looking at this from an educational point of view, making suggestions like kind of generalizing a lot of these capacities into pulling them all together into some like general principles that say, it's from therapists too, contributing to this dialogue, that particularly working with boys and young men, helping to externalize and make some kind of action related activity can help them process a little bit better when they're dealing with severe emotional problems, whereas the let's all sit around and talk about our feelings ad nauseum effect works much better for females than it does for males. And if we don't recognize this difference, we're not going to reach the males. And males that have deficits in these key areas are really kind of a problem for society, in case nobody noticed. Just going to throw that out there.
Or society has a deficit in terms of teaching
well, and that's
these
the
males.
thing. Exactly, that's the thing. Society, right? Why blame the victim? In this case, right? If we're talking about boys, right? They didn't ask to be raised this way.
Exactly.
No, they didn't ask for people to neglect their approach. Now, I've gotten a lot of different, I've had different discussions about this kind of stuff. But one thing I've noticed across the board is when I talk to educators, particularly those that work with children, they're like, yeah, we really need to talk about this. Nobody seems to want to talk about this. Why are we not talking about this? It's an issue. It's an issue. And it's, of course, a political issue. And it goes apparently up to the higher levels. When Michael Gearin, just for example, of the Gearin Institute, he works a lot on developing educational approaches that work particularly well for boys and adolescents. And he has, I attended a talk with him once where he talked about actually approaching Congress to say, hey, we have these initiatives that are helping out our girls. It's time now to look at boys too. And they're like, they don't need that. They don't need that help. And it was, I think, largely a political perception that boys are fine. And they've had, all the advantages over the ages and everything has always gone their way. And that's just really not what we're seeing in the nitty-gritty day-to-day activities of our educational systems. That's a downstream conversation from where we're at now, though. But you can see how this leads to that so quickly.
I'm itching.
Right? Right? I know. And of course, as a male, you can, there's an energy behind this, like, cool. And, again, this is not a zero-sum game, right? When we help out girls and women, we also help out men too, but so does the other way around. It works both ways, right? We're in this life together. We need to figure this out.
Agreed.
All right. So we talked about that, emotional intelligence. Right. So, language ability. We talked about that. Mathematical ability. I forgot to mention this, but general math skill actually doesn't show any gender advantage. And I know the stereotype, right? I grew up in the age of Barbie saying math is hard, let's go shopping, and that causing a huge uproar. In this case, it's like, okay, the uproar was kind of earned there because that's bullshit. I mean, come on, guys. But yeah, they're toy companies. They're going to do what they think sells. They don't really care about anything else. Pornography use, sex drive, masturbation, arousability, all of those measure at a 2 in favor of males. Again, that's an easy one to explain biologically. Because the biological investment into offspring is considerably less in males, then it makes sense that you would go there quicker because that leads to more reproductive success in that particular sex. Whereas it's much more advantageous for females to be a lot pickier because they're investing so much more. Right. And that very thing creates this, I'm not going to say a power dynamic necessarily, but it's sort of like a supply and demand dynamic. Okay. So that creates an environment in which the female kind of has the stopgap rate limiting step, which encourages the males to compete for that attention, which then leads to a lot of these subsequent downstream effects of, well, who wins these? It's not random. It's whoever has the things that the females are looking for, right? That's sexual selection.
Yeah.
Now, of course, this works the other way too, actually. But there's, for whatever reason, not as much written about that, but they're starting to catch up with that and say, look, these are the ways that females, they compete a lot for mates as well. And they just don't do it in the same way. All right. Anybody who's worked with middle schoolers and early high schoolers, how this works, how this plays out, right? When the competition among the males is who's the strongest and who's the biggest and the fastest, who's the captain of the football team, all that kind of stereotypical stuff. Whereas the girls, they don't clobber each other physically, they do it socially and reputationally.
And it's vicious.
Oh, it's absolutely vicious, right? Well, you've got the advantage of someone who has empathy and advanced language skills relative to males. And so that's their playing field.
Yeah.
And if males getting in the middle of that, they don't want to get in the middle of that. It's like, can I throw something or do a bunch of push-ups? I'm lost here, man. It's like, yeah, get out of here, boy. You're out of your depth, bro. Yeah, so run screaming. Partner selection, again, this is a kind of no-brainer, really, but younger partner skews heavily towards males. Okay, any species that has any sort of menopause, like humans, not too many species do, but in those species that do have that, you're going to have this skew. Now, when you get into evolutionary psychology, though, it's important to remember that there's actually two prongs to this. All right, on one end, there's the studies that show that males tend to label as attractive younger females, but within a particular age range, but also whatever age they are too. That's a two-pronged attachment or attraction, interestingly enough. And that really embodies the difference in human males and the males of other species, because human males engage in parental co-parenting, whereas other, like mammals like tigers, for example, there's no co-parenting there. It's all on the female. But because of the fact that that human males engage in parenting, that has caused a shift in all of this stuff. All this stuff now is maybe we're in a transition. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say because Homo sapiens is very young, 200,000 years. That's nothing. But it probably goes before that. There's probably males co-parenting before Homo sapiens. In any case, that's one of the reasons why there's not as much sexual dimorphism in humans, even though it still is there. And there's also this dual kind of pronged attachment capacity. Okay, that's getting into the weeds a little bit. Seeking out an physically attractive partner actually is not a 4, which most people I think would guess would be a 4, but it isn't. It's a 2. So there is a tendency for men to value that more than females, but females do value that. Having a richer partner is a 3 in favor of females. And that's it, again, it's one of those things like, oh, that's just cultural. Okay, yeah, but they already examined that, right? That's cross-culturally, actually. And of course, you have to define rich differently in different cultures, but however that's defined, like whoever has the most number of cows or, achieve the best number of successful hunts or something like that is going to draw the attention of women in those cultures. Okay, rape is a 4, duh. It's very hard for women to rape men. Sexual aggression in general is actually a 2, interestingly enough. The perception of harassment is only a 1. All right, so these guys that are out here saying, well, they're just being oversensitive. Are they though? Right, time to rein it in, buddy. Now, partner aggression, no difference. Partner severe aggression, on the other hand, is a 2 in favor of males. So if there's severe aggression, it's slightly more, there's a moderate skew in that respect. What do you think of partner homicide?
Probably 3.
Yeah, it's a 4 actually. and in terms of
Few
males much more likely to kill their spouses.
Mhm.
So guys, no, just stop. All right. That's scary, honestly. You know, all joking aside, that's a scary one.
Mm.
So is it any wonder that, you know, the women may be a little bit more cautious about getting into a long-term relationship? Because these are things that are biological, okay? Not that this gives an excuse. Remember the naturalistic fallacy.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
No. It's just that the tendency is there and you
Hmm.
need to be on guard for it. And that's not something that the genome is going to ignore. It's going to incorporate that too into, again, the fear responses, the risk aversion, and all of that kind of jazz, right?
Yep.
Females are trying to reproduce and survive just like males are, and they'll do whatever it takes. Sexual versus emotional jealousy is gonna divide out pretty much the way you're probably thinking. All right, so the males are more concerned about sexual jealousy, the females are more concerned about emotional jealousy. And that was a 3. Schizotypy. Now this one kind of came out of nowhere. I didn't know anybody had studied this, but it's skews male.
Yep.
But that's really not all that surprising given the protective effect of estrogens on, this is a well-known effect in schizophrenia. Schizotypy is kind of like, it's on the same spectrum as schizophrenia, but not the full-blown disorder. But it's well known that even though the prevalence is the same in men and women, the severity is quite a bit worse in men. So it seems that the estrogens have a protective effect for whatever reason. Other things, wishful thinking, vividness of visual imagery, abstract reasoning, and general knowledge, none of these showed any gender differences. I wasn't surprised by that, but some people out there might be surprised by that. And then the biggest one, competitiveness. Goose egg, man. Just like I was saying, everybody's got competitiveness. There's not, it's just how does it play out, like you were saying. Okay. That's the list. Okay, that's the list. That's what we've got. These are the differences. We can refer to these back and forth, but I know you got some stuff that you want to bring up and discuss. Let's dive in. What are your thoughts about all of these so far?
But a lot of it makes sense, and you know, even again, like I think a lot of it makes sense in the context of when we observe these things playing out. Uh, those identifiers that aren't necessarily the reported most different, or there is a low difference in the sexes in terms of their expression might be different, right? And those that have the highest differences, we can just observe and say, yes, this is for certain, cross-culturally, transculturally, very much different between the sexes. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think again, while you were going through the list, my mind just goes to almost like these hypothetical instances and individual experiences.
Right, because that's the big question.
Yeah.
What does all this mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean? What do we do with this information?
Right.
That's a tough one. And I
Right.
really think it's important for us to define that question as well as we can, as tightly as we can, before we press on. Like one question is, why should we care about these differences? What is your thought about that question?
Oh, I don't think it's a matter of why. I think we have to. I think if we don't, yeah, I mean, it's these differences are a part of our reality, right?
Mm.
Biology is it's essential to us. There's no escaping it, right?
Right.
So in terms of these observations, not only looking at these observations and saying why do they matter, but looking at actual experience and practically saying that matters. You know, there's no
So
escaping the meaning.
yeah,
Right.
it's because well, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying because if we don't, we're going to wind up making all kinds of mistakes
Mm-hmm.
and running into all kinds of problems. And I think what we need to do as we go forward is to define what those problems are going to be as best we can guess, if we're not already seeing them. Now, I think the springboard for me here is what these things suggest is that these are predispositions at most. Okay, because we know that humans have a very long adolescent period compared to other animals. It's almost eternity.
Mm-hmm.
And this is by design. This evolved because we put so much energy into developing the brain that we actually develop much slower than we probably need to in order to accommodate the additional learning time that the genome already knows we're going to need in order to survive as Homo sapiens. Now, what that means for us in this question is, okay, given the fact that we're going to have these predispositions that we've inherited from our proto-human ancestors and have been fine-tuned for 200,000 years as humans, where does that go? So if I have these are predispositions, the things that we just listed here, but then culture piles onto that. And it will shift us in one direction or another, depending on the type of culture we're in. And I think that's where it gets tricky, but that's where all of our attention needs to be on here. And it's not debating whether or not these things exist. That's a waste of time because it's there, right? Now that we've got the answers to these questions, right? And they're still refining these, of course, but these are findings that are really not anything new.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But we need to look at that. So if a person comes into the world, then because of their male or female, they're going to have this or that set array of predispositions. It doesn't mean they're inevitably going to be A or B. And in fact, they could be those slightly rarer cases where they are intermediate.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly plenty of cases of women who are much more male-oriented in terms of their list of skill sets. They're not interested in people. Their empathy is not all that great. They're interested in physical, competitiveness. Great. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not the point to say that you're wrong for that, right? That's stupid. All right. Obviously. Nevertheless, people go there and I have to say it. So the question of why any of this matters, I think you're spot on. It's because if we don't recognize this, and number one, it's going to be an educational problem. If we expect boys to sit down and be quiet and worry about the rules and care about what the teacher thinks of us and talk about our feelings, girls are much better at all that stuff in general. And so they're going to excel in that environment where the boys are going to fall behind. And everything that I've seen, and I haven't done a full literature search on this, but it does seem as though boys are falling behind academically and in college and all that. And I think it might be because of our education system not addressing those predispositions that most boys have, that they learn slightly different ways. So if there's any educators out there that are experts on this, I'd love to hear, you chime in if you're one of the three. Right. So, yeah. Here's a question. Should we work to try to homogenize these?
No.
I don't know.
No.
I mean, that's the sense I get as some people seems like that's what they want. They want everything to be identical and equal and the same. I don't understand why you would want to try to do that. Why not work within the strengths and the skill sets that you have the predispositions for? As long as you give time to each individual person, whether they're children or not, to manifest whatever it is that they have going on for them, whether it's more male or female oriented or somewhere in between or atypical, right? All of these are perfectly fine. They're all normal variants, in my opinion. But if we don't recognize where they are, we're going to miss the boat in terms of meeting their needs.
I mean, you said an educational issue. I think it's civilizational. I mean, I think this is civilization wide in terms of,
how do you feel that it expands out? I'm not disagreeing with you. I think you're absolutely right. But I want to hear your thoughts, like specifically, how does this expand into that as you see it?
I think, oh, man,
just start with the top three.
Yeah, well, there is I look at it like when there is a complete kind of collective denial of certain base realities that are, just apparent, they're there. When there's a certain kind of collective, uh, when you decide to kind of do away with what you know, the foundation of where you came from is just lost to history. And at that point, not only lost to history, lost to experience. I think we're reaching a point personally, where we can all tell that there is an issue, but we're not identifying the issues for the sake of certain collective ideas, something in the zeitgeist, something in the water, you know.
Mhm.
I think
Okay, so maybe that's the next direction we need to go here is what do you see in the zeitgeist? I think I mentioned this last time that it seems to me, um, from my limited perspective on this, that there's a lot of talking heads out there chattering on
yeah,
about
yeah,
what's up with men, what's up with
yeah,
masculinity. All right.
mhm,
And because it's just two guys here, we'll
yeah,
focus on that, right? And
yeah.
we'll let women come in and add to the discussion if they wish. But what's I agree with that assessment of what is up with it. Like, what are we supposed to do if we haven't figured out what healthy and positive masculinity is supposed to be?
I think we at a certain point we knew how generative life affirming masculinity could be. I think we really need to isolate down like how we want to approach this, because I see a lot of toxic masculinity coming from those that aren't necessarily sexually male or born biologically male, right?
Mm-hmm.
um and again, I don't even like to qualify toxic masculinity or toxic femininity as actually a thing. I mean, yeah, you could say that there are these kind of caricatures in the culture about machismo and being kind of toxically feminine,
Mm-hmm.
wherever it is.
However
But
that works, right?
I think in the culture now, you're seeing these poles push further and further out,
Mm-hmm.
and those that know that there are issues need to come back to the center and say, okay, where are we? Um, I wrote down in some of my notes, uh, well, a couple of things that I noticed and I wanted to discuss, but what is our mainstream understanding of mental illness, and how does that contribute to issues regarding sex, gender, transgenderism, non-binary identity,
Mm-hmm.
um, and reducing everything to psychology, and really there being a lack of a systems perspective, and then going along with kind of the collective ideas, the collective psyche absent of Darwin and biological correlates in terms of men, right? So men, I see as a 32-year-old male who's at the kind of onset of being a clinician, and this might be a risk for me even saying this at
Mm-hmm.
this point. Um, but men turning towards fantasy and inflations regarding fantasy and hyper spiritualism, and women being highly inflated almost on a kind of power based level, and then both of those being extremely narcissistic. Um, and again, those poles being pressed further and further out.
Yeah.
And then how individuals, and I can only speak for myself as a man, and the conversations we've had, but also men in general I've had conversations with, um, how do we re-engage on a more generative level that isn't so polarized in one direction? We were talking off camera before we started. um, how I go back and forth mentioning certain gurus names and so on and
Right.
so forth,
Sure.
but how they're really, it is regressive in the sense that it's kind of trying to bring back this golden age of authoritative spiritualism, and how that might become a savior for the world, or a salvation for the world. And I don't believe, and I don't feel that to be the case.
Yeah.
I think men need to really put their feet on the ground and say, this is our world, this is our life. And if we don't start relating to women in a more
Mm.
generative way, not only women but ourselves,
Yeah.
and own up to that testosterone, like if we just kind of say, all right, we're relinquishing ourselves from this situation, it clearly sucks, we're removing ourselves from the market,
Right, right. So you're talking about men going their own way, right? I'll just throw that out there
Yeah.
because
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
those kind
MGTOW.
of groups.
Yeah.
Now, one thing about that stuff is I wonder how much of that has been almost created by the internet as a means of social interaction to some people to the exclusion of any other kind of social interaction. They get on the internet, they talk to these people that they don't know really. They wind up in these echo chambers. They end up going into these really extreme viewpoints
Yeah.
that gets amplified by the way the internet is set up. Right? And I remember the days back in, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and there was no internet.
Mhm.
And it was just not a thing, right? Just nobody did that. And during the early days when the internet was still being hooked into everything, nobody could have predicted that this was going to happen. That
Mhm.
was not on the radar at all. Um, Nevertheless, everyone was quite a bit disconnected, right? And that wasn't exactly the best situation either,
Yeah.
right? So, um, and any sort of talk about masculinity and manliness centered around the other um, type of cultural expression that I think has not assisted us in humanity is the mass media. And yes, I realize I'm using the mass media to say the mass media is not always good. Aren't you clever for pointing that out, Mr. Whoever you are? No, I'm saying that what the mass media has done since its creation is give us a false sense of culture. Oh, everybody thinks this way. Well, yeah, you hear that from a young age on TV, for example, over and over and over again. It'll give you that impression. When of course reality is way more complex than that. I mean, back in the old days, it was like 5 channels and that was it. So it's real easy to create a monoculture doing that kind of stuff and just smear away all the nuance that's out
Yeah.
there. That's a lot of what got us into where we were at. And now we've got the internet, which is a total free for all,
Mhm.
right? But then that has created a perfect breeding grounds for all this extremism and for these magnetic personalities to accrete all manner of
Yeah.
wackiness to them. But
Yeah.
we still don't have any answers really for what we really want to know, which is like, I want to focus. And so many, I think, men out there, just to use men as an example, want to focus on like, what does a good man do? What is what we are supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
Right. So this was the obvious ones like don't kill people and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But what about deeper than that?
Yeah.
You know, and of course, a lot of answer you hear is, well, just look within and come up with whatever it is that, and that you can only go so far with that. And even doing that is suggesting that there are no external ways of measuring that. And that's in itself a value judgment and expression,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
So again, that's something we'll have to get into next time, but
Yeah.
because we're starting to run out of time, but
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
we are. So
Yeah, there we are. Coming to consciousness. Well, no, you mentioned
yes,
the media, but I do think there is a kind of phenomena right now in terms of information transduction, and yeah, we definitely need to
okay,
get into that. Yeah.
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 Yeah, so I think what we'll talk about next time too is the influence of culture and how that encounters these predispositions to craft cultural ideals of masculinity and femininity in many different ways based on the surrounding culture environment.
Mm.
I've got some pretty I think illustrative examples to use here to show
Mhm.
just how much you can really do with it, quite a bit, and we'll see where that goes.
Mhm.
We'll see where that goes. It's gonna be interesting. So yeah, there we are. That's part two, where we got more to come.
More to come. Thank you, Dr. G.
All right, gang.
All right, everybody. See you around.